Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Eli Noam, the director of the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information at Columbia University. Bill Drake, William Drake, is our director for international research, and he has managed and organized and will lead this discussion. But I will say a few introductory words beyond welcoming you and just making sure that you know that we have this series as well as two other type series ongoing on various topics. Now, UN is the topic here today, post-summit. The summit was here, right here in New York. It usually is part of the General Assembly, whose main contribution to New York City is that traffic is totally, in Midtown, totally blocked. And I participated in it also in the context of the AI part of this. And so for those of us who are not really into this on a full-time basis and make this their professional focus, this is so confusing. The various moving parts of UN, there's the ITU with statements on, say, on AI, there's OECD, there's ISO, and now there's also the Secretary General's office that is also kind of active in this. And perhaps you can, this panel can explain to us lay people what exactly is this trying to do. There's obviously the substantive part, but there's also the institutional, interorganizational part. So on reading about the summit, which comes up with Pact and a global digital compact and a Pact for the future that was approved just minutes before the sessions started, to the point that Secretary General Guterres was apparently had three different speeches drafted: one for a Pact that was approved, one for non-approved, and one something in between. There was an attempt by Russia to change things, but it kind of garnered only the votes of the hardcore of its supporters. But when I read comments that says, sympathetic comments that says, the time for, and I quote, the time for exploring is past. It is time to create these roles being creating positions mandated to represent future generations. In other words, appoint people. It should begin here with the creation of an empowered, resourced UN Special Envoy for future generations. And so I asked myself the question, why is this happening? Where is it happening? Who is pushing this? And perhaps we can get some clarity on this. We're talking here about just the digital part. The AI is a subpart of the digital part, but it's obviously the one that interests this audience most of all. The AI part issued a governance governing for humanity type document just before, which is impressive, but it raises also the question, frankly, which is what exactly are the problems we're dealing with? There are obvious ones, such as, let's say, increasing the capacity building in in countries that are less advanced with AI, capacity building to develop AI and to adopt AI. There are some obvious issues, but then there are some that are kind of much more hypothetical and more conceptual than real, and they're kind of being dealt with in a very broad fashion rather than in a practical problem-solving type aspect. And so the question is whether we're here in the aspiration and kind of like high-sounding, high-minded type declaration business, or whether we're kind of concretely solving concrete problems that are actually in front of us. And so I hope that this discussion will help us, the audience, understand better what has been happening at the United Nations at the summit a few weeks ago and where we're going into the future. And so now it's a pleasure for me to pass this on to Bill Drake, who needs no introduction. I mentioned already he's the director at the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information. for international research, and he had held academic positions at the University of California, University of Zurich, and other places, Carnegie Endowment for Peace, for example. So he is well known to all of us, which is why we're kind of here to listen to him introduce and lead the discussion. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Ellie. Well, if you're confused, you're not alone, but as they say in the business, we hope to, by the end of this, have people confused at a higher level of complexity. So maybe that will be an achievement of some sort. Anyway, welcome everybody to the initial installment. This our third year of this seminar series on global digital governance. We've covered a wide range of topics over the past couple of years. The videos of the previous sessions are on the series website. That was included in the announcement for this event. So if you're interested, you can always take a look at that. And this year we'll be doing a lot of new and interesting topics, such as artificial intelligence, disinformation and information integrity, data governance, and so on. The next meeting in the series will be 4 weeks from today on Thursday, November 21. So to today's topic, we're going to talk about the UN's Pact for the Future and its Annexed Global Digital Compact. As the announcement for this event noted, the Pact pledges a new beginning in multilateralism that will transform global governance and purports to apply those general aspirations to the realm of global digital governance in the compact that's attached to it. Accordingly, today we're going to kind of toggle back and forth a little bit between multilateralism generally and digital multilateralism in particular. So to try to set the stage for that, let me just make a few observations. First, on multilateralism, for those who don't live and breathe in the world of international cooperation and international institutions, multilateralism, of course, is a longstanding architecture of international cooperation and governance that goes back to the 19th century. Generally speaking, there's two common ways of thinking about it. There's a sort of thin definition or understanding of the term, which is that multilateralism is simply cooperation among three or more governments. So it could range from trilateral groupings like the US, Mexico, Canada agreement up to universal bodies like the United Nations. There's also what you could call a thick definition of multilateralism that adds substance to the numbers, that says that it's about cooperation that is based on certain shared ordering principles of conduct. That includes a kind of procedural fairness component, the notion that all states have equal standing and formal equality, one nation, one vote, even if there are power asymmetries, and a kind of concept of substantive fairness, that there's a broadly acceptable distribution of benefits from cooperation, what scholars call diffuse reciprocity, and a presumption in favor of community support for outcomes and processes that confers legitimacy on the activities. And that's really what puts the ism in multi-stakeholderism. There's been four kind of big challenges and trends affecting it in the 21st century. The diffusion of power away from the United States and the West, and the liberal international order that they championed. Horizontal decentralization of activity and authority away from the UN and other centralized bodies to a wide dispersal of different types of intergovernmental organizations and groupings, including ad hoc organizations, coalitions of the future, cross-regional blocs, et cetera, as well as new kinds of transnational cooperation and governance mechanisms. We have multi-stakeholder groups that negotiate agreements and so on as well. So you have a very distributed architecture of governance in different international issue areas, which of course can be seen as incentivizing forum shopping in multilateralism a la carte sometimes. But there's been a sort of an erosion of the UN's claim to unilateral primacy over global governance. There's been a vertical decentralization of participation as states are no longer the only voices at the table. More and more, there's efforts to accommodate non-state actors, multi-stakeholder engagement in varying levels, and a diversification of the kinds of instruments and outcomes that are agreed to, no longer just treaties, but all kinds of normative agreements, pacts, multi-stakeholder agreements, and so on. So turning to the digital side of this then, multi-stakeholder and multilateralism had a lot of tensions over the past 25 years. starting with the whole internet governance negotiations that began really in the late 1990s. There was an effort by many governments, particularly more authoritarian governments, but not only, to push more activity into the United Nations, to use the UN bodies to try to assert greater governmental authority and control in the internet space. In some proposals to replace or overtake multi-stakeholder governance initiatives. There were proposals for many years to have the International Telecommunication Union, for example, replace ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. All this came to a fore in the World Summit on the Information Society 20 years ago, and we had big battles over so-called enhanced cooperation and the efforts to try to establish some sort of new UN body that various governments supported. People may remember India proposing a committee for internet-related policies that would meet for 2 weeks every year in Geneva and sign treaties and oversee ICANN and other bodies. So there was a lot of controversy, which made multilateralism a kind of contested concept, which was funny to those of us who are longstanding multilateralists who always thought multilateralism was an antidote to unilateralism and a good thing inherently. Suddenly, multilateralism came to be kind of viewed with suspicion by many people in the internet communities because it was seen as a sort of way in which governments were trying to assert more top-down control over the internet and the digital environment more generally. Some people have argued, of course, that since the IANA transition in 2016, when the US gave up its traditional authority over the internet root functions and so on, that we've gone beyond multilateralism versus multi-stakeholderism and that it's all kumbaya now, but that's not entirely true. There's still a lot of pressures from some governments, particularly Russia, as Ellie noted, to try to use the UN agencies as a way to expand governmental control over the internet environment and to marginalize multi-stakeholder participation. And we've seen this with the recent cybercrime treaty and so on. All which brings us then to the Pact today. So since 2019, Secretary Guterres has been trying to position New York, the UN Secretariat, as the focal point for work on new digital issues. And this has been a very controversial process with a lot of open consultations, quote unquote, that were really kind of not very serious. Decisions were ultimately made behind closed doors by governments and seemingly not taking into account a lot of the interests and lessons learned over the past 25 years in the global internet environment. And there were a lot of proposals from the Secretariat in New York to create all kinds of new policy frameworks and organizational entities, some of which were problematic, a digital cooperation forum that would kind of sideline the Internet Governance Forum, a code of conduct for information integrity, a new AI office, all kinds of things. And we talked about some of these proposals in earlier webinars in this series. So the final agreement that was reached, and we'll turn then to the panel, tries to address some of these challenges I mentioned before by proposing all kinds of coordination mechanisms, with the UN New York taking a lead role in coordinating both global governance generally and digital governance in particular. So there are a lot of proposals in the text for how other organizations and entities should follow New York's lead. And for the digital stuff, there's a proposal to create a new office in the Secretary General in New York's that would be in charge of coordinating system-wide all activities in the UN around digital. And there's a steering committee of agencies involved that are chaired by the Secretary General that's trying to push these things forward. So there's a lot of issues on the table now about how all this will be done, how implementation will take place, whether the process will become more attentive to real multi-stakeholder engagement and input. And there has not been a good opportunity to really discuss all those things since the summit. So that's what we're going to try and do today. And to start the conversation, we have an excellent panel of returning champions, people who spoke in previous years in this session. We have Fiona Alexander, who's a distinguished policy strategist in residence in the School of International Service and a distinguished fellow at the Internet Governance Lab at American University in Washington, D.C. Fiona previously was for 20 years at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, where she was the associate administrator for international affairs and basically ran a lot of U.S. International policy around internet issues, and she's joining us from D.C. Henriette Esterhuizen is a senior advisor for internet governance at the Association for Progressive Communications, or the APC. Previously, she was the APC's executive director from 2000 to 2017 and served as the chair of the Internet Governance Forum's Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group for 2 years. She was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame in 2013. She's joining us from Geneva, although she's from South Africa. She's in Geneva attending UN meetings now and can tell us what's going on there because they're about the implementation of these issues. And finally, Wolfgang Kleinvector, who's a professor emeritus of international communications policy and regulation at the University of Aarhus. He was a member of the ICANN board of directors, served as a special ambassador for the Net Mondial initiative, and is the founder and chair of the European Summer School of Internet Governance. He joins us from Germany. So we will do 3 rounds of interactive dialogue among the panel, then we open it up to everybody. I see a lot of people participating here who have experience and knowledge in this area, so we're hoping we can have a really inclusive and vibrant discussion. One of the things we want to make distinctive about this series is a lot of engagement from all participants, because there's lots of webinars with panels that talk all the time and leave very little time for people to speak. What we hope to do here is to have much more open engagement from everybody, so we hope people will want to join and help us with that. So all that said, let's turn that to some questions to get the panel going to set the stage for us. Does the Pact for the Future and its GDC annex really point to a transformative new beginning for multilateralism, as is said in the document, especially with regard to digital multilateralism? Do people think that the institutional innovations that are put forward by the GDC can they help to overcome the geopolitical tensions and rivalries that have made global digital governance work in the UN difficult over the years? What's people's big picture takeaway on the state of digital multilateralism after the summit? Let me turn to the panel, and everybody can just toss ideas on the table to get us started. Fiona, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here to chat a little bit today. And there's a lot of people I see in the Zoom that are WSIS, I don't know what to call us all now, we're old, WSIS original experts. So look forward to hearing those perspectives as well. But to answer, or at least give my initial thoughts to Bill's first question, I don't actually think it helps make anything better. I think it actually complicates things, because I think geopolitics have only gotten more complicated around technology, not less, than 20 years ago. And while I think a lot of the existing institutions, ITU, UNESCO, OECD, other parts, we have the IGF, other things have ways to incorporate stakeholders in their own way. We now have the call for new structures inside the New York system, which is from my experience, very insular. And I feel like, in addition to having geopolitical constraints and geopolitical challenges around the issue sets, we've now set up a big interinstitutional fight within the UN system about who's actually going to be doing what. Because if you read the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact as a standalone, you wouldn't think that there are lots of other parts of the UN system, including those that predate the UN, that have worked on these issues for 20, 30, 40 years. So I actually think the lack of clarity around what was agreed and the implementation is actually going to make it actually even worse than it was before. Not substantively, but in terms of where do you show up, who's doing what, how do you participate? I think it's very confused right now.
You're muted. Bill, you're muted.
Sorry. All that is undoubtedly true, Fiona, and we're going to dig into those aspects more. But can I ask the particular things that are agreed, the innovations that they put forward, the International Scientific Panel for AI, the new office in Geneva that's in charge of coordinating everything, the global dialogue on AI. Do you think any of these will help to lead the UN into a new digital multilateral era that's more effective than what we've got, or no?
I think it's too early to tell, because all that's been agreed in the documents is the creation of X, Y, and Z, and a process to debate the modalities of how to do X, Y, and Z. So nothing has actually been agreed full stop to like start tomorrow. So in most of these instances, they're going to have to be appointing co-facilitators who will have these processes to put together how to do it in the context of this new office. That has to go through, I think, the fifth committee in the UN for the budget. And from the conversation we listened to this morning, which Bill and Henriette and I were on, which we can talk about, it seems like there's a proposal, but it hasn't been made public, and it's got to go through a UN budget process. Like, there's a lot of like aspirational things and I'm from the paragraph, a lot of aspirational things that have been agreed to, but the implementation and the how of those things is still up in the air. And I was reading, I think, Bill, you sent it, this explanation statement that governments also put out in New York. I think the US had 147 paragraphs of issues that they had with the document. You know, we've agreed to this document, but basically we have 47 reservation points on the document itself, which I have never seen something like that before. But maybe that's how the New York process works. So that, depending on how you look at it, could invalidate some of the broader agreements too. So I think it's complex, is still my same answer. So.
All right, great. Thank you. And Henriette, I'm sorry, I thought you were still in Geneva. You're back in South Africa. So maybe you can share your views and also let us know what happened in Geneva that's of relevance, if anything, to this.
Thanks, Bill, and greetings, everyone. Geneva was Commission on Science and Technology for Development intersessional, and in fact, there was specific discussion on the Global Digital Compact. The tech envoy was there, so sort of general update, particularly on this question that you raised about the new office, without very clear answers on that. But what was
Henriette, can I just tell you that only the top half of your head is visible on the video?
I will. Okay.
There you are. Hi. Okay. Yes.
Thanks. I actually think I should, if my audio deteriorates, let me tell me and I'll switch off my camera. And what was more concretely discussed was the data governance working group, which is the other outcome. But to get back to your big picture question, I guess I'm not quite as negative as Fiona is. I mean, I agree completely with Fiona. We don't know yet. It is too soon to tell. But I think at the same time, it's will it do any harm? I'm not sure it will. I think there is a need. You know, the WSIS itself did not establish an incredibly well coordinated follow-up mechanism. Since then, as Bill outlined in his introduction, there's been various initiatives, usually from global south countries, to establish some kind of mechanism. We've now reached a point where at a practical level, dealing with digital is so distributed across the UN system, from counterterrorism, cybersecurity to intellectual property. Virtually every UN agency now deals with some aspect of digital governance. So the idea of having a single agency has always been insane, and thankfully it still seems insane. However, having an office that plays some kind of coordination role, theoretically, I don't think is a bad idea. And I think particularly because we are dealing with so much geopolitical fragmentation, I think the GDC objectives, if you just look at them as standalone objectives, they are important objectives, I think, for the global community, the multilateral community, and the multi-stakeholder community to revisit and prioritize. The digital divide, it's still a massive concern. So having that emphasized is important. It depends, of course, whether we act on it. The issue of inclusion in the digital economy is again, it is a major issue, and it's a global issue because different parts of the world are benefiting in very different ways. There's a concentration, a very vertical concentration in power and access to resources and markets, even in the digital economy, you know, that I think is a concern. And then inclusive, open, safe digital spaces, that's also also concern human rights. The fourth objective, obviously, is focusing on data governance. And I think it's very good that that is featuring as a standalone objective, because data governance probably is the cross-cutting issue that is a challenge in all digital governance arenas, including AI. And then also looking at AI, I would have perhaps liked less focus on AI as a standalone issue, but it definitely is an issue that needs to be discussed in an inclusive way. So whether it will work or not, that I cannot tell, but I do think it is appropriate to have actually tried to deal with some of this fragmentation between, on the one hand, the Sustainable Development Goals process and the World Summit on the Information Society. They've never effectively interfaced. And then similarly, to deal with how different parts of the UN are dealing with these things, and then how different parts of the world are dealing with these issues. Whether the proposed mechanisms will work or not is a completely different story. But I think having this now, and having it emerge not as a proposal from India, Brazil, South Africa, as Bill reminded us, but actually as an outcome that has consensus support from member states, is not a bad thing. I think in principle it could work, it might not work. And there are many, many factors that might make it not work. But I do think it's needed from the perspective, this kind of galvanizing and focusing of attention is needed. And I'm saying that coming from someone who works in the Global South, where digital inequality actually defines our digital reality.
That's an important point to always keep in mind. Thanks, Henri. I think there's an interesting tension between the two views that have been expressed here about New York's coordinating role that we'll come back to more. Wolfgang, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much. Reading the Pact on the Future, my impression is that the Pact is waiting for a new future or a better future, because in our divided world now, the conflicts are so deep, and that the agreement that more or less 193 heads of state could agree on such a very general text is, on the one hand, a big achievement. On the other hand, it doesn't say anything. And let me check here. Okay. And so my reading is that at this moment, nobody wants to kill the United Nations, but nobody trusts the United Nations that they can produce any reasonable, concrete results. So we are more or less in a transition period where we have not yet a clear idea, how to manage all the challenges of the future. So we are based in the mechanisms and principles we have since World War II. So that means all sides refer to the Charter of the United Nations, but China and Russia has a different interpretation and understanding what the principles of the Charter of the United Nations are. And also the United States, European Union supports the Charter of the United Nations. International law is the basis, which is primarily the Charter of the United Nations, but they have also a different understanding. So there's a huge gap in understanding of what the United Nations is today and what it should be tomorrow. And so we have now, because the dynamics of the process after the 75th anniversary of the United Nations produced this Pact on the Future. But for me, this is something like an interim result where it could have been worse. So we could have seen a collapse, but it does not really make a step forward. And the same is to the Global Digital Compact. So certainly it could have been worse. If you read the policy brief number 5 from the Secretary General of the United Nations 2 years ago, there was all kinds of proposals and initiatives which have undermined the achievements of the last 20 years in the field of internet governance, including the establishment of new bodies, the removal of the technical community as a stakeholder group, to sideline the whole concept of multi-stakeholderism for internet governance, and much more. So that means nothing happened. So that means But I agree here with Fiona that the outcome is not really a step forward. It just reconfirms what we had. So, but it adds some additional confusion. And so in my final part here in this introduction, I want to go to 3 concrete subjects. One is, and here I agree with Henriette, the only step forward I see is that now with these action lines, which has been under discussion in a bubble for the last 10 years, but were more or less not really relevant for the global internet community, are now have a greater visibility. And it's clear that this vision action line should be combined with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. What Henriette has said, that connectivity, bridging the digital divide and all this, this is now a priority. And it's really a scandal that nearly 20 years after the World Summit on the Information Society, around 2 billion people have no access to the internet. So this was made visible with the Global Digital Compact, and I think this is an achievement for the Global South. So that I think this was not the key issue between China and the US or European Union and Russia, but for the Global South, this is a key issue. And insofar, they are probably the winner of the Global Digital Compact. My second point refers to the concrete subject of our discussion here, multilateralism. So multi-stakeholderism is not in the title of our seminar here, but this was behind all the debates. And what I see is that we have made no millimeter step forward in the understanding how multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism works hand in hand. You know, in the revision 2 of the Global Digital Compact, there was a reference to the Net Mondial conference and the Net Mondial principles and procedures. So I think this question is, since 10, 15 years, not yes or no for multi-stakeholder approach, but it's the how you practicize it. That means every country now pays lip service to the multi-stakeholder approach. Even China and Russia say we need the technical community, we work with business together and with the civil society. But the open question is how you practicize it. What we have seen in the GDC process, where a number of deep dives, multi-stakeholder consultations and other, but there was no procedure in place, you know, how the input which came from the non-state actors had any impact on the final outcome. So that means it was forgotten. There was no documentation, you know, how governments have discussed this input for non-state actors and so on. And I think the Net Mondial conference in Sao Paulo made a step forward by developing the Sao Paulo guidelines, multi-stakeholder guidelines. So, and this is would have been a step forward to say, okay, here you have guidelines how to practicize the multi-stakeholder process. And nobody could explain me, even neither in New York nor in Geneva, why this reference disappeared again from the revision 2 of the Global Digital Compact. So it was there, it would have been a step forward.
Henriette, you need to mute.
So my second point is the relationship between Geneva and New York. I think Fiona mentioned that already. I see, unfortunately, status quo for Geneva, but a status quo plus for New York. And so that means the trend, what I see now from these developments is we will have more digital discussions and negotiations in New York, which is more multilateral, and less in Geneva, which is more multi-stakeholder. So, and I think this is could produce a negative development with regard to the involvement of stakeholder and the further enhancement of the multi-stakeholder approach. So these are my 3 points. Thank you. Back to
Thanks, Wolfgang. That was very helpful. And actually, I want to pick up on that last point. We'll come back to the WSIS and multi-stakeholder cooperation more generally in a second. But just for now, the question I was asking about, how transformative is this? I mean, precisely the point. When you move things into the New York environment, away from the specialized agencies, you were getting closer to the whole intergovernmental world of the General Assembly and the high politics and so on. And so my question is, as I look at these new mechanisms that have been proposed that are supposed to be transforming governance, and then I look at the way international policy is debated in New York, I don't see how having a new mechanism like a scientific panel solves a problem if you've got China, Russia, and the West at each other's throat over the most fundamental issues around everything in international politics, much less digital. So that's my question really is, do we think that the institutional frameworks that are supposed to have reinvented multilateralism here will allow us to progress further given what the circumstances out there in the world are around digital issues from a political and economic standpoint? Does anybody have a thought on that particular aspect? Fiona, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think to comment first on something Wolfgang said, which is I agree. I think it's Geneva status quo, New York plus. But I don't think it means there's less conversation in Geneva or Paris or wherever. I think those still happen and probably, more vigorously now because they want to defend their turf. And now you also have the New York stuff. So it's just more and more. And so the question is who follows the more and which part of the more do you follow? And if you're a stakeholder, where do you put your emphasis and your time? And if you're an academic or a company, like where do you go? And I think it lends itself to much more forum shopping. In terms of this larger geopolitical question, I don't know if these new mechanisms help break that log jam or not. I mean, the AI panel, I think, is supposed to be independent. So theoretically, again, they've got to work out the specifics and the modalities of how they're going to do the panel. But I'm assuming it's going to be some selection of independent experts that aren't necessarily tied to a particular country. And they put out reports similar to what we saw with the AI group now. And then it's a question of what happens to those reports and those documents and how are they taken up in the broader UN system. But I just don't see how the larger geopolitics that is New York, where this issue is never going to be the priority. It's just not. It's not what New York is for, right? There's so many other things that are happening in New York. I just don't see how it gets the same level of emphasis from national governments as the conversation goes forward. Not when you're talking about Security Council reform and not when you're talking about serious issues of global geopolitics and war and famine and things like that. I just don't, as much as I love technology policy, I just don't think it gets the same caliber or level of engagement in a New York system.
Maybe we don't want that though, so that'd be okay. Either of the other.
I would agree. I would agree with you and with Fiona, Bill. I think there's in a way, it's one of your questions you might pose to us. But I think that what this process has also done has, I'll put on my camera. It's also reveals, as you say, the weakness, the risk of UN based processes in New York is that they become so politicized. But I think what this has also done is revealed the weakness of the WSIS processes, which is that they haven't actually effectively been able to engage politics. And I think this for me is quite an interesting challenge. And I think that I absolutely am in favor of keeping most of this discussion within the specialized agencies and based in Geneva, much more accessible to civil society, to developing countries. But we also have to deal with the politics. And if we don't, we'll reach our own kind of stalemate. So I think there are risks both ends here, but I think certainly at the level of achieving concrete outcomes and reaching, particularly at a technocratic level, and let's face it, a lot of this digital policy needs input at a technocratic level, much stronger in the Geneva basis. But at the same time, surprisingly enough, we did have the open-ended working groups produce relatively useful outcomes. And if you look at what the open-ended working group on international cybersecurity achieved, which the group of governmental experts could not achieve, was much wider knowledge and acceptance within countries that international cybersecurity is something they need to think about. I think the trick is to use New York for what it's good at and then to move the discussion away from New York to a place where it can actually achieve more concrete results. But unfortunately, the real world, including the UN real world, doesn't work like that. They're always, different institutions are trying to stake their claim and territoriality. But theoretically, there could be a productive a relationship between the more political level engagement in New York and then the more practical results-oriented engagement in the specialized agencies.
Thanks. Wolfgang, do you want to add anything to that, or should I just move on?
Yes, okay. Let me add a comment on AI and then on what Henriette just said to cybersecurity. On AI, I agree with Ellie Noam in his introduction that the only concrete outcome is that we have and push for capacity building in AI. So I think this is concrete. But I really do not understand fully what AI governance is. Everybody speaks now at AI governance, and it's really difficult to understand. So when we defined internet governance 20 years ago, there was a big confusion what internet governance is. So we made it very simple in the very last line of the definition and said, this is related to the evolution and the use of the internet. So the use of the internet is, everything you're doing with the internet is more or less part of internet governance. And it's much more than just the distribution or coordination from internet identifiers. It's all issues. So what is AI different from internet governance? So that I don't know whether we should really buy this AI governance as a big new issue before we clarify that. Certainly, you could take the European AI Act as a blueprint with the risk-based approach that you have for categories. But even in the EU now, say that there is a growing confusion, how to define all this and, who will say, which risk category is this. It's very complex. And I see from the HLAB report that they have identified 7 or 8 different processes. They more or less said it's a fragmented discussion. And the G7 have the Hiroshima process. So we have the global program on AI in the OECD. There are several other initiatives, the British process from the Bletchley Declaration. And then the conclusion was, okay, now only 7 countries are involved in all of the initiatives, and 143 countries in the world are not involved in any of the initiatives. So that means what the United Nations could do is really to bridge the knowledge gap and to say, okay, this is a place where you can inform others. But this could be done within the Internet Governance Forum, where we have a policy network on AI, where you can exchange views and exchange information, what the different groups are doing. So, but I have my doubts whether the United Nations could, or also this new scientific panel, could produce any global AI governance framework or something like that, because I have difficulties to understand what AI governance is. And my second point to Henriette with the open-ended working group on cybersecurity, and on I could add here also the Cybercrime Convention, which was mentioned by Bill in his opening. So these are very good examples, about the relationship between multilateralism and multistakeholderism. If you go to the Cybercrime Convention, so the interesting thing was, this was rather open to non-state actors. So they could participate in the meetings, they had a chance to speak, they could present papers, but a participant from the negotiation said, okay, the real things happened behind closed doors. So that was not in the open sessions. And at the end of the day, there was a remarkable agreement between civil society and the business that this is, as non-state actors, that this is a bad treaty and governments should not sign it. But finally, governments ignored all the input which came from non-state actors, even if they were in the room. And we have now this complicated treaty, which will be put on vote in, I think, in 2 weeks or so in the General Assembly, and then governments have a problem whether they sign it or ratify it. So this could be is another bad example about lip service to multi-stakeholderism and what really happens. And in the open-ended working group, so you have this very restrictive approach to a non-state actor. So that means every government has a veto and can say, no, we do not want to have this civil society or business actor. So Russia has even vetoed the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the Ukraine has vetoed the Moscow Institute for International Relations. So this is a very politicized process and has nothing to do with the understanding on multi-stakeholder digital cooperation as it has emerged in the last 20 years in the IGF, ICANN, and with this context. Thank you.
I would add that we did a session on the cybercrime treaty negotiations last year, earlier in this year, in this webinar series that was very helpful in unpacking some of the problems there. I just wanted to, well, actually, I think we should probably—
Can I just react to that quickly, Bill?
Go ahead, Henri.
Before you
I was going to come to you. Yes.
I absolutely agree that that's a bad treaty. But I think we also need to be reflective of ourselves as the so-called multi-stakeholder internet community and including the IGF. To some extent, doesn't the emergence of that treaty and the emergence of what's in the Global Digital Compact, isn't that a result of where our own processes actually failed to move towards the next step? So much of what we've done in multi-stakeholder internet governance in the last 20 years, firstly, a lot of it has been about process. Secondly, so much about knowledge sharing and collaboration. But in terms of filling normative gaps, even at a voluntary level, how well have we done? Have we done well enough? Have we dealt with the issues of accountability, for example, effectively? I think there's been lots of attempts, but I think that if we want to, for this course of the multilateral, with the intergovernmental processes stepping in to new challenges that capture the world's imagination, like information integrity, which I think is a nonsense word, but anyway, misinformation, like the terror of AI and robots eating the world. I think we need to be more proactive as well in what we do in terms of our work on norms and decision-making processes and accountability, because otherwise this pattern will just repeat itself. Some new crisis will emerge, some new challenge. The multilateral intergovernmental system will step in. We might not like what they do. So I think, and Wolfgang, you referenced the Sao Paulo guidelines. They're fantastic guidelines, but they do still primarily focus on process. I think we really need to look at how this community gets to a point where we can make decisions that integrates both multilateral and multi-stakeholder forms.
I think the notion that some of the impetus for intergovernmental or multilateral activity in part reflects failures in the multi-stakeholder environment is a very interesting one, and one that we've talked about in the past. And I think it's maybe a good way to poke some conversation. I want to really open it up to the floor. Fiona, just a real quick point before we get some people involved.
I just wanted to add on to Anriette's point. I don't disagree that, some of the pushes and challenges are coming because the multi-stakeholder system isn't addressing some of these issues or not in a way that people want. But I do think that some of the bigger challenges that we have in this system, and what we've always had in the system, at least from my experience as government, is that within each national government, there's siloed policy apparatus and siloed players. And that's why you end up with a bad convention on cybercrime, because the position taken in New York is not one that reflects the whole of the US government. I understand they're now having broader conversations. Will they change their position? I have no idea. But I do think that what happens in New York and what happens in different institutions is that each of those institutions or structures has a government agency client, so to say. And I think the lack of coordination within governments causes some of these problems as well. So
that's absolutely the case. Okay, let's open it up to the floor. I see Ambassador Karklins has his hand up. Ellie has his hand up. Peter Major had his hand before. It seems he lowered it, but whoever wants to get in. So could people just introduce themselves when they speak so that everybody else in the room knows who they are. So Giannis, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone, at least here from Europe. So let me.
Giannis, could you say who you are, please?
Yeah, I am ambassador at large of Latvian Foreign Ministry in charge of climate diplomacy and cybersecurity. But I used to be the chair of the preparatory committee of the Tunis phase of the World Summit. So let me do 3 points as it is practice here. So first of all, on UN. UN is far from perfect, but it is still the only existing universal organization that we have. So it is a multilateral but intergovernmental. And we really need to manage expectations when it comes to multi-stakeholderism and bringing multi-stakeholderism in UN. So UN will not become a multi-stakeholder organization because it is not set for that. But what is happening, that multi-stakeholder input is accepted more in Geneva than in New York. Nevertheless, it is much more accepted than it was before. This is meaning before 20 years. So that's the first point. The second point is that we need stop maybe talking about digital as a separate issue. I would argue that everything is digital. If not now, then will be in the next decade. So whether that is a welfare, whether that is a healthcare, whether that is even a warfare. If you analyze what is happening now in Ukraine, the warfare instruments are predominantly digital, and that is the reality, and there is no way going back from that. And secondly, about the visas. So I can claim some paternity in that sense, but I need to remind that Tunis was about dial-up internet. Tunis was about internet with the 1 billion online with the dial-up internet. And Tunis was not really talking about actual use of internet. Tunis was talking about governance of the internet, governance of critical resources, whether USG should make the oversee role or management of critical resources, or there should be some other model. So in 20 years, things have evolved enormously, and now the big unknown or big fear is this AI thing, data governance, which are part of digital, but it is actually use of digital or evolution of digital things that needs to be understood, and that needs to be put in place in a way that is not perceived as a threat. Because if you think that, for instance, government of Netherlands have fallen because AI AI system which managed their recruitment policy was discriminatory towards women of color. So that means that there is an issue with AI enabled applications. So we need to deal with that. Council of Europe did it with them agreeing on the Framework Convention. EU worked on this EU AI Act. So this is a big unknown, and we need to explain it. And UN is a natural place where these things could be discussed. And again, more we participate, better outcome will be. Thank you. I'm sorry for being long.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Giannis. That was very helpful. Let me take two other inputs, and then we'll come back to the panel, and then we'll open again to people. Ellie, you had a comment.
Yes, thank you, Bill. When WSIS was started, I was in Geneva, I was in Tunis, I've been to other events over the many years, and it's kind of a little bit always the same. I mean, there are high-minded declarations being passed, and people are busy, and then they go to the next event and the next conference. And so in a way, we should be kind of a little bit modest. What has this process actually accomplished if it hadn't existed? Now, of course, the environment has progressed enormously, but that's kind of like taking credit, like the rooster taking credit for the sun rising. So the question now is, given that there is this new institutional setup in New York, let's just assume it's a reality. What concrete, not procedural, because we're talking about process here all the time, agencies, coordination, this and that. What concretely can this new setup, this new agency in New York, should it do in a very practical way to address a very practical problem rather than dealing with coordination of coordinators?
Nicely put. Okay. And then we also have Peter Major joining us from Geneva, I'm assuming. Peter, are you there? Hello.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Could you introduce yourself, please, Peter?
Well, I'm Peter Major. I'm the vice chair of the CSTD, and I have been chairing some working groups in the CSTD on improving the Internet Governance Forum, enhanced cooperation. And
That's the Committee for Science, Technology, and Development for people who don't know that.
Yeah. So the GDC gave us some mandate to set up a working group, a multi-stakeholder working group on data governance. And as Henriette put it in the chat, it gives us some hope. We are working on that, and probably we start the working group at the beginning of next year. The working group should produce some results by the 81st session of the General Assembly, which is in 2026. Now, as it is a multi-stakeholder working group, there will be participants from all stakeholders. And as previously in the CSTD, the stakeholders will be on equal footing. The other thing, which is a novelty, we are going to have a chair of the working group, but we are going to have two vice chairs. And there was some proposal to have a vice chair from a non-governmental group, which is, to me, is a kind of small revolution in the US system. So I really look forward to this working group, which will be completely open, that is open to observers, meaning those governments who are not members of the working group itself will be participating. The non-governmental groups will participate. There is one condition: they should have ECOSOC accreditation or WSIS accreditation. But otherwise, I hope we will be able to have it online in a hybrid mode. That is, those who can't make it to Geneva can participate remotely. And I'm really optimistic about the outcome. And I think this is the way to prove that Geneva is still there, and we are advocating the multi-stakeholder approach. And hopefully we are going to produce some results.
Thanks, Peter. Well, maybe the data governance piece is one where we could come back to Ellie's question about showing me concrete effects. How might this actually matter? But let me come back to the panel then to respond to. So Giannis has raised three different interesting questions around multi-stakeholderism and digital being inseparable from everything else. And with this process, Ellie's asked about, show me concrete impacts. How does this stuff really matter? Not just process. And Peter's given us an example of some of the work that's being done to take it forward that could be more multi-stakeholder in character. So panelists, your thoughts, please, in response to any of those points. Fiona?
Well, and I don't want to be the negative person, so but I do. I know I play that role well, but I do. I sort of I'm sympathetic to Ellie's question, because a lot of what comes out of these conversations is an agreement to have an agreement to have an agreement, and people claim success and they go home and then go to the next meeting. And so I think you have to look for the things in that where you can actually move it forward, like the CSCD data governance working group. That will be interesting to see how that goes forward and what it comes practical that's out of it. But a lot of the other stuff that's in the GDC and the Pact for the Future, again, it's an agreement to do something, and then the proposal for how to do it has still to be negotiated. That's why I think there's a lot of let's see what comes out of this, for at least for me, from a lot of this. But again, I think it's the broader question of what's the utility of the UN and what's the utility of the UN in these type of issue sets. And I think that's been a question that's plagued, at least since I've been doing this, but since before, I'm assuming, like, what comes out of all these conversations and what comes from it, right? What do people come, I mean, the same thing, what do people get out of going to the IGF? When I was in government, I found the IGF particularly useful and a particularly useful tool to take back what I got from that meeting to actually do my job. So the implementation wouldn't necessarily have been a direct thing that you might have seen, but it definitely is an implementation that I can point to. So I don't know if some of that kind of stuff comes out of this, like the data governance working group. But I do think that it's hard to point to practical things that come out of the UN as a general matter.
You mean, but just to be clear, are you saying that about all UN or just UN New York?
UN New York, but even some of the expert agency stuff, the implementation of what comes out has to happen either at a national level or it has to happen at companies or in another environment. The UN itself implementing stuff doesn't actually happen unless you're talking about like specialized food programs and things like that. I don't see a lot of implementation by UN itself.
Yeah, no,
I could be wrong, but I don't see that much of it.
generally not their thing. Henriette.
Thanks, Bill. And I think, I agree with what Jan has said about the role of the UN, and I do think that we shouldn't underestimate the technical assistance role that many UN agencies play in many developing countries, particularly least developed countries and small island developing states. There is still a role for technical expertise and evidence-based decisions in the UN, and they do trickle down to what happens at national level. And I think Giannis is right. Digital is everywhere, and I think that's why it is good that we never set up a new agency. Is there a need for something that plays a coordinating role across the UN? I think there is such a need. I think there isn't a need for a new empire to be built, in the Secretary General's office, but for an effective, open and inclusive liaison function within the Secretary General's office. I think there is a need. So one practical role it can play is to facilitate better interaction between the STI, the Science, Technology and Innovation Forum that emerged from the Sustainable Development Goals process. That's part of the annual SDG review process and the Geneva work. The ITU actually makes a lot of effort to engage with that process, but it's all kind of Geneva to New York rather than New York to Geneva. So reversing that relationship a little bit so that New York is much more actively engaged with Geneva would be good. And I think the office of the envoy does have staff in Geneva, which is good as well. I think the other role that this office could play is also just to keep member states informed of when there are digital issues that are being discussed elsewhere in the UN. And then I think we also shouldn't think of New York as being in a parallel universe. If we think of really important UN decisions, and the one that's closest to my heart is the Human Rights Council resolution on human rights that apply in the offline world, also applying in the online world, and linked resolutions such as those on privacy as a right, on encryption and surveillance, the resolutions on surveillance. These Human Rights Council resolutions find their way to New York, and they find their way and they are resolved in the General Assembly. And that's what actually gives them power. So I don't think we should look at these processes as completely delinked. I think what are my fears? I think I just want to raise one fear, which I think that we haven't really raised, and that is that I think the global, one of our biggest challenges in digital is inequality between countries, within countries. The challenges of dealing with concentration, with monopolies. Europe has a very different regulatory approach to that, what we find emerging in the US and, of course, China, and the rest of the world kind of somewhere in the middle. I think I also fear a little bit that this process that's taking place within the UN is kind of bypassing that. It's not articulating to this actual work that's being done and how to develop effective regulation. And I think if the UN is just going to become a space where more treaties are made, where more international agreements are made, and pressure on member states to domesticate these agreements, I think that will be a very bad development. I think we need much more testing, experimenting, research, understanding of when regulation is needed and what kind of regulation is needed by whom. I'm not opposed to regulation, but I think it shouldn't be the first port of call when we are dealing with challenges that are related to digital. And then my great fear, out of the GDC, and that's specifically to AI. I attended an event in New York. I was there for the summit just at the end of the process. And the US State Department had an event the day after where they launched a huge, big AI for SDG initiative together with OpenAI, Amazon, I can't remember which other, big tech companies. And for me, that also rings enormous warning bells. Are we actually, with this emphasis on AI, just creating new opportunities for companies that already have so much control over what happens with digital and development to again, in the same way that mobile operators claimed the space of bridging the digital divide and then failed to do it? Are we going to have the same here with, the big tech AI for good companies claiming the space, saying they're going to solve the world's problems, capturing the interest of policymakers, when in fact the bottom-up solutions that we really need that diversify markets and diversify access and control and innovation is going to get very little attention. So that's kind of one of my biggest fears around the GDC and particularly the emphasis on AI.
That's thanks. That's really helpful. That's a big tension. Where on the one hand, many of us who come from the internet environment really have always championed the notion that there should be much more multi-stakeholder engagement, et cetera. But on the other hand, you find a lot of governments and other actors who are very concerned about the possibility of capture. And that when you have all these processes, and this is not just in the internet and digital space, if you look across the UN, there's been more and more effort to engage the global private sector in doing a lot of operational type things. And a lot of people worry about whether or not that increases their influence in ways that may not be optimal. And that's something we should take into account as well. Wolfgang, come to you real quick and then go back to everybody. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's the old problem, glass half full or half empty. So that means I remember times when the UN was blamed to undertake efforts to control the internet, to overtake the internet. UN will control the internet. This was a headline in the New York Times at the eve of the Tunis summit. So, and when Guterres came to the IGF in Berlin in 2019, his argument was the United Nations do not want to control the internet. We want to offer a platform for multi-stakeholder discussion. So I think that's a long way from 2005 to 2019 from the United Nations. What we have seen now since 2019 is it's difficult for the United Nations really to implement the promise, what Guterres said in 2019 in Berlin, that this is a platform where you have equal participation of all stakeholders. I think what Peter said, referring to the UNCSTD working groups, and he said, with the new rules for the chairmanship of the next data governance working group, this is a big difference, because indeed I was a member in 2 of the working groups. You have been there on equal footing. That's a big difference to what has happened in New York. But, we should never lose our optimism that also in New York we could introduce some procedure which would more open and producing space for button-up policy development. But as Yanis has said, I think the world is now a digital world, and even the question of peace and war, as he said, is a question of digital policy. And, Guterres wants to have a treaty on autonomous weapon system until 2026. So the question is, autonomous weapon system, is this an issue for internet governance? Is this a digital issue with all the, the robot dogs and drones and all what we have to, it's an issue which needs more discussion. And I think the best place for such a discussion is the Internet Governance Forum. I hope that we can renew the mandate for the IGF next year for 10 years. And then the paragraph 27 of the IGF, which defines the mandate for the IGF from the Tunis agenda, is broad enough to accommodate all these new issues. So there is one subline which says, IGF should deal with emerging issues. So all these things which happened since 2005 are emerging issues. They are now real issues. We see new emerging issues on the horizon. That means to strengthen the IGF, also to strengthen it financially, and to invite also the very large online platforms to contribute to the IGF, because they benefit from the internet and they, do nothing really to support the discussion platforms. I think this is a challenge which should be discussed when we debate WSIS plus 20 and the renewal of the IGF. Thank you.
Thanks. I just, before, I want to try and get more people involved, but let me bridge by saying, replying a little bit to Ellie's provocation about how does this all matter? Is this just people going to meetings and debating angels on the head of a pin? Part of the problem here, I think, is that the impacts of international agreements are not always visible in a tangible sense. If you're not talking about a treaty with binding commitments that then have implementation mechanisms built in and so on. But a lot of this stuff actually does have an impact on sort of things that are maybe less evident. Institutionalization of the issues around the world, the building up of national capacities, the growth of convergence of governments' focal points around these issues. And the fact that when we take internet governance, when we started the internet governance stuff and the WSIS process 20 years ago, most governments had no mechanisms in place around internet governance. In the course of that process, we went through a lot of collective learning and co-adjustment to each other, through which governments built up their domestic capacities. They built up the institutional frameworks and national laws and so on that allowed them to participate in international processes. You don't necessarily see that as an outcome. It's a very distributed, diffuse kind of outcome. But it's an outcome nonetheless that matters and changes the character of the world in important ways. So the point I would make is, you can have agreements that are binding and have concrete, definable, pinch points on governments' capacities. And, you can look at the WTO and other places where there's binding agreements and then there's sanctioning if people don't follow the rules and so on. But even in cases where the agreements are more normative and so on, they can have a lot of impacts. The impacts are just more diffuse in ways that perhaps are not tangible unless you are heavily involved in these processes. And I understand that that's a frustrating answer to people who want to be able to point and say, well, what does this really affect? How concretely does it affect things? And sometimes it's not clear. But, Giannis still has a hand up, and I don't know if that's from before, or is it a new hand? Giannis? If it's an old hand, I'm going to just, I've noticed in the chat, Charles, Avri, Chris, Mike, Diane, Kwaku, people offering a lot of comments. Any of you guys want to jump?
It's an old hand, sorry.
Okay, no worries. Anybody want to jump in on the conversation and add something here to the group? Avri, go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Avri Doria. I'm a text worker. So I've been looking at it, and this is a sort of a recapitulation of what I put in the chat, but I was totally, from the moment Guterres started his whole move towards organizing this, I've been very much against it and trying to be a road sign along the way saying beware. It's happened now, so I've started taking the look on the other side of it as sort of accept that it has happened, that there is this expand and look for how it can be used to improve things. So one of the things, and I think a lot of you have said it all the way through, but sort of on the flip side of little bits of multi-stakeholder modalities start to interfere with the New York way of doing things. I don't think that's bad. I think that that's a good thing. It's incomplete. We're having the same discussions now that we used to have in Geneva about, we've got to get inclusion. We've got to get the stakeholder voice heard. We've got to do that. We never would have had those conversations about New York back then. Breaking it through 20 years ago to Geneva was a big deal. And Peter gave us an example of how some of it actually flourishes in time. So taking that flip side and sort of seeing that this is an opportunity. Wolfgang, you even mentioned it at some point of sort of one can see that there is some. The other part is anything that gets done in a large case needs to go through the General Assembly, as others were mentioning it, getting them involved because they've got the ultimate power and such. So I see opportunities there. I see the ability to sort of move the multi-stakeholder modalities, move the stakeholder, and perhaps move the notion of multi-stakeholderism without bringing all the baggage that got into sort of the reification of the Tunis agenda stakeholder groups where everybody's fighting for their piece of the turf, and get back to some of the basics of what it means to have multi-stakeholder modalities that include the voices that should be included on a particular issue. So I actually, having been dead set against it until the day it was approved, now that it's approved, I'm looking at it as, okay, what opportunities? And especially when you add the Sao Paulo guidelines, which you're right, they're not accepted and in there yet, but they get mentioned. They get brought up by Jorge or somebody that basically that comes, and that includes the whole notion of bringing multi-stakeholder modalities into multilateralism. So it might turn out to be a good thing, and more opportunities to discuss these things is a good thing, not a bad thing. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's a real question because, the process, unfortunately, for the GDC leading up, and people have mentioned this, was highly problematic in terms of they were saying, oh, we want multi-stakeholder engagement. This is all going to be open and transparent. And then it wasn't. I mean, we would have these meetings where, consultations where, people could just line up to make 2-minute statements that were then ignored by the Secretariat that had no impact on anything that was done. And so people look at those kinds of experiences and say, what are the possibilities that this UN New York type process can grow to accommodate real meaningful participation from stakeholders? It's an open question. And I guess the point that Avri is making, which I think is a good one, is we should be optimistic and try to press and leverage and ask that these things be made more open, affirmatively say, if you're going to create a new office, the new office should function like this. The question is how to do that. Chris Buckridge, please introduce yourself.
I will. Hi, Bill. Hi, everyone. Chris Buckridge. I'm on the mag. Let's go with that. I don't have a huge amount to say here, but I do agree very strongly with Avri. I think the only way to proceed at this point is to look at the opportunities that present themselves from the situation that we now have. And I mean, I think coming back to a bit what I was saying in the chat, I think we need to sort of see 2 decades of WSIS sort of consensus and sort of agree to sort of play with multi-stakeholder models, to develop multi-stakeholder governance. It is a real achievement, and perhaps an unlikely achievement that we've made it this far with how much has evolved in terms of the technology and what it means for society, that we're still looking at multi-stakeholder governance of that technology as a viable route, I think is a huge achievement. And I think we need to look at that sort of how we can sustain that going forward, but also we need to think in terms of what we got with Tunis probably does need some revisiting. We probably do need to look at new technologies, new ways that the technologies we already had or that have evolved are being used. And yeah, maybe we'll come out looking a little different in the end, but if we can sort of use that success and momentum we still have from WSIS to integrate some multi-stakeholder ideals and principles into those new governance approaches, that's I think the opportunity we need to be trying to capitalize on.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else from the chat who'd like to get in, or else I'll go back to the panel for closing observation, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, not hearing any expressions of interest. Let me circle back to the three of you. If you have any synthesizing closing thoughts based on everything we've talked about thus far. Fiona, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, again, I think, there's a lot to be determined. So I think it's important to see how the next year or so unfolds with some of these proposals to implement the GDC and the co-facilitators that are going to be set up to do different things. I think my big takeaway, and I listened this morning, the Office of the, I don't know what it's called, the tech envoy, had a town hall. I think there's one happening right now as well, where they tried to solicit input from people and tried to explain things to the extent they could. And I thought that was great. And I thought that was more open than what we've seen in the past. Built in the acronym there. And I think to Avri's point, I think, it's an opportunity to kind of push open and make things more transparent. And they actually even asked this morning, as in our chat has rules, but they were asking what improvements can we do and how can we make things better? So, there does seem to be some willingness on the New York staff end to kind of do things better. I still think, at least for me, it's hard to figure out which of these different things to go to. I only have so many hours in the day. So I think that's going to be a challenge, even for people that are, larger groups or larger civil society groups or academics groups or companies. That's going to be challenging to figure out where to go. But I do think that there is an opening to do more. I just don't know what it is. And my takeaway from this morning's earlier session was that I think the WSIS plus 20 review is actually even more important than I thought it was going to be. It's not only going to be about the future of the IGF, but it's also going to be about, it's an opportunity to try to weave all these threads together and bring these things together with GDC implementation, with this new office, whatever form it might take, with working with the different existing institutions and processes, and then with the IGF. So I think the sessions that are planned for Riyadh on this conversation will be important, but I do think the WSIS plus 20 process is going to be even more important than I thought it was going to be, and a good opportunity to kind of pull things together in a way that makes more sense to all of us.
Thanks. Henriette, your thoughts?
Thanks a lot, Bill. I like Avri's approach. I think it's very pragmatic. And I do think that the compact does point, we've spoken not about digital divide issues at all, because I'm probably, there are a handful of us in the call that do care about that. But it's a major issue. As I said at the CSTD this week, the number of internet penetration in Africa has dropped. It's lower. We reached 40%. We're down to 37. What does that tell us? It tells us that something in how we're doing digital and development is not working. So let's look at and let's try and use the Global Digital Compact to get that kind of galvanized action. Secondly, I think it really is a challenge for the UN agencies. It's a challenge for the IGF. And I think we need to rise to that challenge. I agree with you, and WSIS plus 20 is very important. I think the IGF needs to demonstrate that it can actually play the role that everyone wants it to play. It needs to evolve. It needs to be more inclusive, more innovative. It needs to address both the development issues as well as the sort of cutting edge innovation and the challenge of regulation issues. And I think that's very important as well. I think the data governance working group that CSTD will host, that's multi-stakeholder, is a really interesting opportunity. I think, as Peter says, there's an innovation here in how it will be chaired by having a non-state actor co-chair. But also just having a data governance working group that will have developing country and developed country voices on it, that will look not just at data protection and cross-border data flows to be sufficiently open to drive a globalized digital economy, but also cross-border data flows that gives national digital economy strategies enough to also work with, to have some kind of sense of being able to shape those policies and strategies. So it's a very interesting opportunity. And I think, is self-governance working? Is global self-governance working? My connection is unstable. Taxation, for example, there's a taxation discussion happening in the OECD and in the UN. They're very different ideologically, and they have very different asks. Are we talking about taxation of big tech and the IGF? No, not really. Are we coming up with multi-stakeholder solutions to taxation? No. So I think there's a real challenge here for us to in the multi-stakeholder community to be much more proactive and take on these normative discussions in a slightly different way to what we have been doing, because I think we can actually add value to it, and hopefully this initiative will be a bit of a kick in the backside for us.
Thanks. I think people have to be hopeful about this. Wolfgang, your closing benediction.
Yes. I agree with Avri that we should look more on the opportunities and to say what we can do, what we have. And so there are certainly, Henriette mentioned, there are opportunities, and we can do something what we have learned from the last 20 years. It's always stumbling forward. So you have small bits and bytes, and there will be no grand solution. So that means you have to move forward with small steps, which are much better than big jumps. Big jumps will not impossible, but you have to be also realistic. So I just this morning checked the so-called Kazan Declaration from the BRICS Summit, which was adopted yesterday. And it's a document, nearly 50 pages with more than 100 paragraphs. And there are 5 or 6 paragraphs on digital issues and AI and others. So they refer to around 20 UN documents, but there was no mentioning of the Global Digital Compact at all. So that means the BRICS countries obviously do not take this very seriously. So, and I agree also with some speakers that the implementation will take place to a high degree on the national level. So, and insofar, I think what we see also are more bilaterals, so that a lot of things, of issues on the agenda we discussed here will be negotiated in smaller groups, in bilateral meetings, or some people have introduced the language of plurilateral, so which is complicated to pronounce. So that means small group of friends, come together and try to manage an issue which is, under their control. So that means we will see probably more fragmentation also in policy discussion. So that means while the IGF could remain the central place because the IGF has no decision-making power, but if it comes to places with decision-making power, then this will be more and more fragmented. And I agree also with Fiona that the WSIS plus 20 is probably more important than expected. So I think 20 years ago, we said, okay, there will be another meeting and some bureaucrats will sit together. But now, with this context, WSIS plus 20 will be a very serious process. And what I see is also that there is another, I would not say monster in the making, but for 20 years, we have now the so-called UNGIS, the United Nations Group of Inter-Information Society. This UNGIS is a collection of around 35 UN organizations, all intergovernmental organizations. But what I've seen in the last 1 or 2 years is that suddenly, governments have discovered UNGIS as an interesting place to make it more effective and to coordinate all digital issues, within UNGIS. But UNGIS does not have a multi-stakeholder advisory group. So I think this would be a very good proposal to say, okay, if UNGIS gets a bigger role in the WSIS plus 20 process, then so UNGIS should invite a multi-stakeholder advisory group so that not only governments sit together and plan, to coordinate among this broad range of issues from healthcare to environment and to other issues. All these organizations are in UNGIS, in UNESCO, FRO, and WMO and WTO and so on. So, but here we need also a multi-stakeholder advisory group. This would be probably a concrete step forward to make things better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfgang. And I think, yes, the UNGIS process does need to be more open. I think the general point that people are making that these things are done, as much as the people had concerns that as they were ramping up, they're there now. And we have to figure out how positively we can try to leverage them and push them towards enhancing openness and so on is, I think, a good place to end it and hopefully give us a forward-looking orientation. So listen, I want to thank everybody for an interesting conversation. As I mentioned at the outset, our next meeting will be in 4 weeks from today on Thursday, November 21. I was originally thinking we would do something on AI, but in light of the American election, I'm thinking maybe we should talk about disinformation and information integrity, because there's a lot of efforts to try to do something at the international level there that I think are interesting. Anyway, we'll see. I'll come back to everybody with the topic. I also want to do a session sometime about BRICS, but again, that's for the future. As always, I want to thank Jason Buckwhite, the Executive Director of CITI, for making this meeting happen. And again, videos and sometimes transcripts will be on the website for the series. Let me turn it back to Ellie for any closing thoughts. Ellie.
Very few closing thoughts. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, United Nations, for giving us endless opportunities to discuss what is happening. And there are things happening and what is not happening. And there are things that are not happening. And we can discuss why these things are happening and not happening. And so this is a good forum. And Bill, we thank you for organizing it. And the audience, we thank you for participating actively in our activities. See you later in November.
Bye-bye.